What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
DC fans, my peeps, I was sitting here trying to figure out what story I was going to do for a classic DC story, because I'm not nearly as well versed in classic DC as I am with, Marvel stories before All New, All Different Marvel. And so I figured if I'm going to do stories before the New 52, then I've got to do something big, something that just pops. So I'm coming out, boom, 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 guns blazing. We're doing Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, a little bit of exposition, a little bit of lead up to this. So before Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC's continuity was an absolute mess. Not only that, Batman's comics were on the verge of cancellation because they just couldn't get them to sell due to the restrictions from the Comics Code Authority. I actually have a video on that. There were all kinds of different things. A really good example is Wonder Girl, Donna Troy. So when Wonder Woman had her publications and she was wildly popular, DC decided to take the Superboy approach. And what they did is they wrote a series of stories starring someone called Wonder Girl. And it was designed to be Wonder Woman when she was younger and the various adventures that she had. And the problem was that whether it was through miscommunication or a lack of concern, when the Teen Titans were launched, DC took the character of Wonder Girl and they threw her on the Teen Titans. And so it created continuity problems because a question fans had was, how can you have Wonder Woman as a girl and the stories are supposed to be her in the past, but she's currently in the present? And so instead they rewrote her origin story. And so that, in conjunction with things like Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, where you had the evil Justice League called the Crime Syndicate, it created all kinds of different issues. Fans didn't know where to start. And so in 1985, under the writing of Marv Wolfman and the artistry of George Perez, DC said, everything stops. We're gonna reboot it all. We're gonna wipe the slate clean and we're gonna start over. And that was Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, the way this starts, the way this picks up is we initially get this short little origin of the universe. Now, there will be a huge explanation that we'll get later on, so don't worry. DC doesn't leave us hanging with the origin of the DC universe. Keep in mind, all this stuff is before the New 52, so this is all original content with the first reboot that they did. But they basically tell us, of course, in the beginning there was nothing, and then we got the multiverse, and there was an infinite number of Earths that came into existence, all of which were wildly different and they were totally changed. They had their own experiences and so on. Now, initially we pick up in Earth 3. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, Earth 3 is essentially the opposite of virtually all other Earths that we saw. The main stories, main universes in this will be Earth 1, Earth 2, and Earth 3. Earth 3 is the Crime Syndicate of America, an evil version of the Justice League. And so instead of Wonder Woman, you have Superwoman. Instead of the Green Lantern, you have Power Ring. Instead of Superman, you have Ultraman. And instead of Batman, you have Owlman. But they are basically villains. They're bad guys. The superhero on Earth 3 is actually a guy named Alexander Luthor. Now, for those of you guys who read Infinite Crisis, the Alexander Luthor that you recall is actually the child version that we'll see in this story that grows up rapidly fast. But the idea here is that we initially pick up with a guy named Pariah. Now, we'll find out more about Pariah later on, and it's actually kind of interesting the way his story goes. He's really like a scientist and an explorer, but basically he's being forced to jump to different realities and watch those realities die. Now, all Marv Wolfman really gives us here in the beginning is just this idea that no one can save this universe, that Ultraman, the various members of the Crime Syndicate, they can't do anything to save their reality, that this universe's version of Alexander Luthor, who's married to Lois Lane, they can't save their reality. And so in a very Superman-esque sort of situation, once this antimatter wave begins sweeping through all known existence, they quite literally send their child out. Now, the reason why I say this is Superman-esque is that with Krypton originally, dying due to its own destruction, the result was that Jor-El sent his son, Kal-El, into space, and he arrived on Earth. And much the same way, they basically send him into the multiverse. Now, the reason why this is done is because before Crisis on Infinite Earths, Earth 1, Earth 2, and Earth 3 had crossed over before. And so it wasn't as though Alexander Luthor had no idea what universes were out there. He had an inkling of an idea, and he basically just kind of sent the child into space, more or less hoping for the best. And so what we do is we transition to the introduction of two characters, or really the introduction of one character and the reintroduction of another. The character that we're reintroduced to is a girl named Lila. Now, she's existed before. She first showed up in the Teen Titans, I believe, but she's basically reintroduced here as a girl named Harbinger. She's effectively someone that has the power of matter. She can just more or less manipulate matter, but she is an assistant of a guy named Monitor. Now, again, we'll get all this information here later on in terms of where they come from, but Marv Wolfman and George Perez are very finicky, or not really finicky, they're very, scant on information in the beginning. Instead, it's more or less like reality holidays are ending and we're trying to save people. And that's basically it. But what he does is he goes to Harbinger and he tasks her with finding heroes from across all space and time from whatever planets are left. And so it's just kind of like grab who you can from where you can and then bring them here. And that's exactly what she does. She creates duplicates of herself and she sends them across multitudes of times. So of course she goes to like Gorilla City, for example, on Earth, and she ends up grabbing their king. She goes to the 30th and 31st centuries and she grabs the Legion of Superheroes. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the Legion of Superheroes was a huge deal when it first came out. And because of the DC, one of the big issues they ran into in the early days of the publications is you had the Justice League, you had the Teen Titans, you had the Suicide Squad, or what would become the Suicide Squad. And so it was like, you know, all the modern day teams were basically covered. And so the question was, well, where do you go from there? If you've covered the modern day teams, you can only have so many heroes on so many teams because they don't have an infinite number of heroes. And so the question was, all right, well, let's try something different. And so they went to the future basically, and they said, here is a superhero team in the 30th and 31st centuries called the Legion of Superheroes, and it was wildly popular. And so what they did is they started crossing them over with the Teen Titans and some of Earth's other heroes, and it just bolstered their popularity even further. And so what we end up doing is we end up grabbing a girl named Dawnstar, and then we just join the rest of Harbinger's clones as she starts grabbing other people. Now, behind the scenes, and what we'll actually learn later on is, of course, because this story is, you know, 30 years old, what we end up finding is that the Antimatter, who, of course, again, we'll get a little more exposition about him, a little more explanation on his origin, he has what are called shadow demons. And shadow demons are more or less henchmen that work for him, and we'll see them, you know, as we progress through this story. But one of the shadow demons latched itself on to one of the duplicates of Harbinger. And so when she eventually reconsolidated herself, it resulted in her basically having a fraction of the Antimatter inside of herself. And what it does is it creates this dichotomy where the side of her that's influenced by the Antimatter says, kill the Monitor, and the side that's influenced by the Monitor doesn't want the Monitor to die. And so it'll play out in an easy to understand way as we get through this. But again, this is really just her grabbing people as they can. Now, one of the most important people that she grabs is a guy named Psychopirate. Now, Psychopirate has the ability to manipulate the emotions of others. And initially, it didn't seem like it was going to be that big of a thing. It didn't seem like it was going to be that significant. But we'll find that when Psychopirate is joined by Barry Allen, when he's taken by the Antimonitor, the acquisition of Psychopirate by Antimonitor turns out to be one of the most important things that he grabs here. But again, Harbinger basically just takes Psychopirate and initially seems to whisk him away to the layer of the Monitor. And so what we do here is we basically join a lot of these pre-crisis heroes. For example, Superman from Earth 2, which is basically the golden age of superheroes. So Alan Scott, the Green Lantern, Jay Garrick, the Flash, they're not here, but that's the era of heroes that they come from. This is basically the original Superman from Action Comics #1. We also have Ted Kord, Blue Beetle. We have a handful of others, the Green Lantern, John Stewart. It's basically just heroes grabbed from different points in time, and they're all initially brought here. Now, they don't really know why, and in fact, a lot of them seem to argue amongst themselves, some of which is due to the fact that Psychopirate starts manipulating them, but also because of the fact that some of these shadow demons start showing up out of nowhere and start attacking these various heroes. Now, eventually they ask the question, what's going on here? You know, whoever you are, reveal yourself. And the Monitor basically shows up and says, hey, this was somewhat of a test. I wanted to see whether or not you can handle the task that I'm going to bestow on you, because all of your universes are getting ready to die. And so what we do here is we initially pick up with a young boy. We pick up with a guy whose name is Anthro. And Anthro hails from a future whereby humanity has been pushed to the brink of extinction. Now, he's not the most important character ever in the history of stories, but the only reason why I mention him is because we'll eventually pick up with Superman here in a little while, and we'll join him. And I didn't simply want you to be without any explanation of who that guy is. But what happens here is there's basically this sort of shuffling, this mixing up of time and space, in the sense that we have Anthro, who witnesses the 30th century before it immediately disappears. We have people in the 30th century who were suddenly met with the arrival of woolly mammoths who are just time displaced. That's really all that's happening, is that time and space is being disheveled and is being thrown awry. And so picking back up again with these various superheroes meeting with the Monitor, of course, again, their question is, why are we here? What's going on? And he says, I've assembled you for the purposes of trying to help me defeat my foe. Now, the Monitor doesn't tell them everything that's going on. And in fact, he's very enigmatic to a lot of these heroes. There were stories that took place before this where the Monitor began providing arms, and even the Antimonitor himself was providing arms, weapons, and so on to various people. But that was designed to be a test to see whether or not those heroes could fight for the Monitor and fight for the Antimonitor. It was basically them just kind of determining who would be best suited to fight on their own, fight on each of their behalf. But the result is that the Monitor has basically created these giant pillars, these energy towers. Now, those are the guys who read, I want to say it was Jeff Johns John's Green Lantern that dealt with the Antimatter coming under the control of the Black Lantern Corps. If you recall, maybe it was Infinite Crisis, I don't remember, but there was a giant tower that had the Antimatter melded into it. This is where that comes from. This is where Geoff Johns grabbed that kind of a thing. And so again, we initially transitioned over to the Guardians of the Universe. Now, this is only a quick thing, and we actually won't see them again for a little while, but the Guardians of the Universe are actually the core reason for why this happens, for why we're having Crisis on Infinite Earths. Not them directly, but one of their guys named Krona. And so even though, you know, Marv Wolfman only gives us a small glimpse, even though he has them analyzing this antimatter wave and realizing it seems there's nothing they can do, but they have to try their best. And while they are imprisoned or they're kept in stasis, I'd like you to keep them in the back of your head because they're gonna be wildly important. And so from here, we jump to Earth 1. Now, Earth 1 is basically the universe that exists after the introduction of Barry Allen. And so all the superheroes that you see that Barry Allen fights alongside, Superman, Wonder Woman, so on and so forth, those are Earth 1 characters. The superheroes that, you know, the Green Lantern Alan Scott, I guess, fights alongside, that is Earth 2. So hopefully that can help you guys differentiate things. But again, we basically join these heroes as they've been dispersed throughout all space and time to guard these towers that have been created by the Monitor. Now, we don't exactly know why a lot of this was done, but we suddenly realize that the Monitor is met with the arrival of Alexander Luthor from Earth 3, the last survivor of his universe. Now, initially it's just kind of monitoring him. It's really just keeping an eye on him, watching what happens, but the Monitor is also curious about Alexander Luthor because he's aging so fast, but also because he has such a high intelligence. Now, transitioning back to some of these superheroes who are monitoring these towers, you know, keeping an eye on these towers and defending them, of course, again, Pariah makes his presence known. Now, with Pariah showing up here, it's basically just another instance where he's being forced to watch a universe's destruction. And that's exactly what happens. This is, you know, where initially we believed that it would be kind of like a last battle at the Alamo, where Earth 1 is where this final battle would take place between the Monitor and the Antimatter, or the Antimatter and the superheroes or something like that. Instead, that doesn't happen. Effectively, all this stuff gets wiped out. Earth 1 gets annihilated, Earth 2 gets annihilated, but it's really gonna be this mass panic that we'll start to realize here in a second. But again, we also transition back to Antimatter as he's taken Psychopirate captive. Now, the interesting thing about this is we don't see the Antimonitor until about halfway through this story. Instead, the Antimonitor is just kind of this disembodied voice that communicates with Psychopirate. And the question Psychopirate has is, why am I here? And Antimonitor says, because you're the most important piece of the board. Now, losing Psychopirate for the Monitor is a huge deal, and we'll find out why, because again, it really seems to change everything. But picking up with Earth 1, which is the comic book universe that you guys are most familiar with, is basically the elimination of all things. And it's really people trying to understand what's going on. You have Wonder Woman, Donna Troy, you have Dick Grayson, Nightwing, you have Superman, you know, you have all these heroes that are trying to figure things out. Batman doesn't even really know what's going on, but in truth, this antimatter wave is sweeping throughout this cosmos so fast that none of them really have time to react. And so while Flash, you know, reappears to them after having vanished previously and says, hey, look, we have to find a way to stop this, like this world is going to end, but there's still a way to save things, he suddenly just disappears. He simply just vanishes, and no one initially knows where he goes to. And so again, Marv Wolfman really gives us an idea of just how grave this situation is, just how many people are watching what's going on when we switch to Brainiac. Now, Brainiac is really just kind of out in space here. He's really just doing whatever it is Brainiac does when he's not fighting Superman or attacking Earth. And he comes to this realization that there is an antimatter wave sweeping throughout the cosmos. Now, Brainiac, with his extremely advanced intellect, also realizes that this antimatter wave simply cannot be stopped. It doesn't seem as though there's a way to bring it to an end. But if there's anybody on Earth that may have a way to end it, it's Lex Luthor from Earth 1. It's the Lex Luthor that we are the most familiar with. And so what we do here is, again, we pick up with a few of the heroes here and there who are fighting against these various forces, some of whom are time displaced. They're thrown out of their own time period. They're thrown into a future time period or something like that. You know, we pick up with like Ted Kord, Blue Beetle, who's trying to guard one of these towers, but they're also fending off against the shadow demons of Antimonitor. It's really just Marv Wolfman kind of giving us a quick run through of what's going on with a lot of these heroes. And the reason why he does this is because while that's happening, we have the heroes on Earth 1 trying to understand everything and trying to bring everything to an end. And suddenly we have Harbinger, who's basically taken over by the influence of the Anti-Monitor, who turns her weapons against Monitor and who annihilates him, who completely wipes him out. And so the question that people have now is, what's going to happen? With Pariah having been thrown from universe to universe and watching each universe die, and having been thrown into the presence of the Monitor, Pariah is now is now in a situation where he believes that there's no way to save the multiverse. There's nothing that can be done. Now, something else that I also want to do here is I want to turn your attention to the new Dr. Light. Now, those of you guys who were following DC in the 1990s, you recognize this version of Dr. Light. I'm sure that you do. And the reason for this is because the Monitor had this idea that there's basically going to need to be someone who can rally the heroes together, or at the very least, who can stand at the precipice, really among their ranks. Now, the reason why I say this is because Dr. Light is exactly what it sounds like. It's, you know, in this instance, Dr. Light's able to manipulate all forms of light. But the reason why this matters is because the shadow demons of the Anti-Monitor have a weakness to light. And so what this would mean is that if all else fails, if these pillars were to converge into a single location, then Dr. Light would quite literally be able to fend them off by herself just by absorbing light from anything that emits light around her, absorbing that light into herself, and then just continually shining it and keeping the shadow demons away. It's really just a way for the Monitor to buy time to keep the shadow demons gone. That's one of the reasons why I say Dr. Light would really be kind of like at the precipice of these heroes, because while they have to fight the shadow demons in hand-to-hand combat, Dr. Light could defeat them in the most feasible way possible. And so again, we pick up here with a lot of these superheroes, you know, going against a lot of these different shadow demons. Again, it's really just kind of a way to show us exactly what's happening in this point in time. But ultimately, we're basically met with Pariah meeting alongside the Monitor prior to his death, and then having to witness the Monitor die. And so what we have is this situation where Earth 2 and Earth 1 basically seem to be gone, that the multiverse in its entirety seems to have been completely eliminated. And so the question that we have is, if this is the case, if the antimatter wave of the Anti-Monitor was successful in eliminating the entirety of the multiverse, then what have happened to these heroes? What's going on? And what we learned was that, you know, the Monitor dying was part of his plan. And the reason for this was because the vast powers that he possessed, you know, to manipulate reality in its entirety were limited by his physical body. And so after his death, he basically reveals a hologram image or a recording to Lila, to Harbinger, and to Pariah, and he says, this was my plan, that by destroying my physical body, you've released my energies into what remains, or what used to be existence, and what I've done is I've basically created something called the Netherverse. And the Netherverse is essentially like this little sliver, a little pocket dimension. It's very akin to Battleworld from Secret Wars, for those of you guys who read that story, and it's essentially a place where he's gathered what remains of what he could grab and stored them there. And so there are heroes, there are planets, there are locations that exist from the remainder of the multiverse prior to its collapse that have all been stationed here. The problem with this is that it's people from all spaces and all times. And so you have dinosaurs in the 30th century, you have soldiers from World War II who are in the modern day. They're seeing things they've never experienced before. Now, initially this wasn't a huge deal, but the most notable heroes from throughout all space and time, all history of the DC multiverse have been gathered together under the direction of Harbinger and the now older Alexander Luthor, who's basically grown into really past adolescence, into his 20s or so, as well as Pariah. And when they bring them here, they basically say, yes, the actions of the Monitor, resulted in his death. Yes, that was part of his plan, but it's all left to us. And he says the only way they can basically win is, of course, to defeat the Anti-Monitor, or at least defeat whatever this foe is, but also to essentially create one universe. And this is basically where Marv Wolfman is coming along and saying, this is the purpose of Crisis on Infinite Earths. The purpose of Crisis on Infinite Earths is not to recreate the multiverse. The purpose of the story is to effectively eliminate the multiverse and then create one universe going forward. And so again, the other half of this is that because of the fact that Psycho Pirate has been brought before the Anti-Monitor in the moments before the multiverse was collapsing, in the moments before its entire collapse, and in the time it took between when it was collapsing and when the Monitor grabbed whatever he could and brought them over to this Netherverse, that Anti-Monitor had reached out and grabbed a character named Red Tornado. Now, those of you guys who were reading the New 52, or those of you guys who read the Earth 2 line of stories in New 52, that name will sound familiar to you. Red Tornado will be familiar, and the reason why is because in Earth 2, in the New 52, Red Tornado was basically an android with female features that had the mind of Lois Lane inside of it. In the Crisis on Infinite Earths story arc, Red Tornado is its own being, it's its own entity. But what Anti-Monitor says is that instead of Red Tornado manipulating winds and so on and so forth, the Red Tornado was a vastly powerful being. Now, Red Tornado is effectively going to serve as part of the Anti-Monitor's machine in creating this antimatter wave that's going to eliminate the Netherverse in its entirety with the intention of recreating the multiverse as an antimatter multiverse. That's really what the Anti-Monitor is shooting for, and we'll find out why here in a little bit. But with Psycho Pirate having been told that operating as a henchman of the Anti-Monitor would mean that he would be able to basically basically manipulate a world of his own, or I guess, you know, a reality of his own, he's basically told, yes, this is exactly what you're going to get. You're going to get the ability to manipulate realities of your own. And this is where we get the actual plan of the Antimatter. What he does here is he basically bolsters the power of Psychopirate. Psychopirate's ability to manipulate emotions are now planetary level, really, you know, universal level. And what he does is he basically has the Antimatter tap into the emotions of all these people who exist on the fragments of realities in this Netherverse and essentially manipulate their emotions and start turning them against one another. Now, while this happens, we also have the Guardians of the Universe that are still alive in the Netherverse, and we also have Ultron, which is still alive in the Netherverse, and it grabbed Lex Luthor from Earth 1. And so it was really more of this thing where when the multiverse collapsed, the Monitor had just reached out, grabbed people wherever they happened to be at that time, and brought them into the Netherverse. And so things are pretty much the same as far as they remember for those who are out in space and weren't actually on planets. But again, because of the fact that all these different heroes are fighting one another, we basically have like Shazam fighting against Supergirl. It's really one of these scenarios where it's kind of the dream matches that a lot of people always wanted to see, but it's also a less expansive version of the Battle World events that we saw in Secret Wars from Marvel Comics. And so what we have here is essentially Lila coming to this realization that the influence of Psychopirate is dependent on his power boost from the Antimatter. And so in order to keep everybody from fighting themselves, she basically burns her powers out. What she does is she essentially moves the entirety of the Netherverse away from the influence of the Antimatter. And while it does restore things to normal, she's inherently human now. She has no superpowers. She's basically burned them all out in an attempt to essentially keep everybody alive. And so with the destruction of the Monitor's fortress, the question that everybody has now is what's next? Not only that, they also have a lot of questions that haven't been answered on who the Monitor was, who their actual foe is, how all this stuff works, and what exactly is taking place. And so what Marv Wolfman does is he effectively gives us this sort of end-all be-all origin of all things. And what he tells us is that when this universe came into existence, originally, there was only one universe. There was only one DC universe, which we could call Earth 1. But what had happened was somewhere along the line, after the Guardians of the Universe, once the Owens basically kind of elevated themselves in science and so on and so forth, one of their kind, a guy named Krona, wanted to witness the origin of all things, but it was forbidden. But despite this fact, he used a computer to witness the origin of creation, and in doing so, not only gave birth to the multiverse, but also gave birth to the Antimatter universe. Now, what this did is this basically created two opposing sides, the evil Antimatter universe and the good, or at least for lack of a better word, good, positive matter multiverse. In response to this, the Owens formed themselves or christened themselves as the Guardians of the Universe. They imprisoned Krona, and they set about basically correcting the error of their mistakes, looking for a way to create superheroes, or looking for a way to create a police for the universe that could basically offset this introduction of evil. And so what they did is they initially created the Manhunters, and when the Manhunters proved to be a failure, they created the Green Lantern Corps. Now, behind the scenes, we also had a group of Owens who didn't necessarily see things the exact same way the Guardians did. Instead, where the Guardians wanted to use the Green Lanterns as a peacekeeping force, some of the Owens wanted to use them as soldiers, getting rid of what they called undesirables. The problem with this was that the term undesirables was an open term. There was really no definition on what undesirables meant. And so the Guardians saw this as the first steps to creating a dictatorial universe. And so instead, they basically engaged in a civil war with these other Owens that, had really harsh views. And as a result, the Guardians of the Universe maintained control over the positive matter multiverse, and in turn they sent the evil Owens off to the Antimatter universe, where they took up residence on a planet called Cord. Now, while they were on this planet Cord, they effectively evolved into what we call the Weaponeers. That's where these came from. But while all this had been happening, when the multiverse had been formed, the Monitor came into existence. And when the Antimatter universe had been formed, the Anti-Monitor came into existence. The kicker was that they had just slept. They were basically dormant. But eventually, the Anti-Monitor woke up. Now, we weren't initially told how, but what we learned was that this is why Pariah is more or less being forced to witness all these things. It's kind of the penance that he's paying. Pariah was a scientist much like Krona. The issue was that when he set about exploring the origin of creation, he inadvertently woke up the Anti-Monitor, and when he did, the Anti-Monitor destroyed his world and then began a conquest to basically start wiping out everything and absorbing all the antimatter energy in existence to make itself this absolute ruler with the purpose of wiping out all things things in existence and then recreating the universe or the multiverse as an antimatter multiverse. And so in response to this, the Monitor started realizing what was going on and they fought one another, which ultimately leads us up to where we are right now. So what this does is it basically creates the status quo. It tells us where things are at this moment, and it gives us the origin of the DC universe before Crisis on Infinite Earths. Now, something to keep in mind is that for those of you guys who jumped into DC Comics with like the Justice League Darkseid War, the information that you found in there gets rid of all this stuff. It basically replaces all this stuff. It's what's called a retcon or retroactive continuity, where a writer comes back and they change the status quo with regards to what it is that they're doing. And that's essentially what he did. Of course, there's a lot of things that go into that, but that's more or less the gist of this. In addition to all this kind of stuff, this exposition, we're also met by the arrival of the Phantom Stranger and the Spectre. Now, the Phantom Stranger is like this enigmatic being that's just wildly powerful, and no one's ever really explored that as far as I know. We don't really know the full heights of his abilities. We don't really know anything about him. That's why he's called the Phantom Stranger, is he has the capability to do, or at least it seems though he can do almost anything, he just never really does. When it comes to Jim Corrigan, when it comes to the Spectre, he's like the wrath of God. But one of the kickers to this, and it may have been something that I missed, I'm not really sure, but one of the kickers here seems to be that for whatever reason, the powers of Jim Corrigan don't really work to their fullest in the antimatter universe as it stands right now. Now, it seems as though the reason behind this is because the Antimonitor has just absorbed so much antimatter energy that it basically just negates the powers of Jim Corrigan. That seems to be the case, but we're not entirely sure. At least I'm not entirely sure. Again, if you guys know something that I don't, feel free to post it down in the comment section below. But moving on to Alexander Luthor, the reason why his character was so important here is that when he passed through the dimensional barrier between the time it took for him to get from Earth 3 prior to his destruction and arriving in the realm of the Monitor, he had basically become like a living energy conduit. He has the ability to harness both positive and antimatter, and in turn, he can basically create portals to anywhere, and he can create dimensions. And that's what he does. And in fact, this will be a major component when it comes to the end of this story with regards to Superboy Prime, to Earth 2 Superman, to Earth 2 Lois Lane, and even Alexander Luthor himself, which will actually be picked back up once you guys get into Infinite Crisis, which is where all that kind of stuff comes from. But we'll talk about that once we get, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But because of the fact that the Antimonitor still resides in the antimatter universe, and they're more or less just kind of left in this no man's land of the Netherverse, Alexander Luthor says, okay, fine, I will create a portal, I'll create a way for us to access the antimatter universe, and we will go there and we will fight the Antimonitor directly. And that's exactly what they do. Now, interestingly enough about this is that the villains actually have their own plans, and it actually kind of works, and we'll get to that here in a second. But we end up joining these superheroes as they immediately get into the antimatter universe. But what Marv Wolfman does is he also provides some caveats here, specifically when it comes to the various members of the Superman family, Supergirl, Superman from Earth 1, Superman from Earth 2. The issue with them is that they've basically lost their invulnerability. Their super strength remains, their flight, their, heat vision, all that stuff's still there, but it's basically just Marv Wolfman taking away from making these characters a deus ex machina, where they can just basically end the entire situation. Because in truth, any foe that Superman from Earth 2, that Supergirl, Kara Zor-El goes against, that Superman from Earth 1, if they were to fight them all, fight that being with all three of them fighting at the same time, they would probably lay waste to the Antimonitor. And so by giving them a weakness, making them, easy to kill basically by losing invulnerability, it makes it possible for the story to have a compelling ending. And so while they do face off against some of these threats of the Antimonitor, what I want to do here is I want to transition away from these various superheroes, and I want to move over to the death of Kara Zor-El. Now, the death of Kara Zor-El was huge when this happened. I mean, this was nuts, because when she first appeared, she had a huge following. A lot of people really liked her. The kicker was a lot of people also saw her as like a spin-off of Superman. Now, that started to go away as she began to grow, in the sense that while she was technically a spin-off, she also developed her own character, and it was also done really well. But one of the questions people had is, how powerful is Supergirl in relation to Superman? And people always said, well, Superman's more powerful. What Marv Wolfman did in this story is he said, while Antimonitor was facing off against all these heroes, while Antimonitor was taking all of them out one by one, Kara Zor-El was the last man standing. She was the last person who was able to fend off against the Antimonitor and held out the longest. And so what Marv Wolfman basically said here is that between Superman Earth 1, between Superman from Earth 2, and Kara Zor-El from Earth 1, she's the most powerful out of all of them, the most capable. And it solidified what a lot of people liked about her character, but it solidified what a lot of people wanted too. And so what happens here is that with her death, Superman from Earth 1 loses it, because this was his cousin. This was a part of his family. And he's so outraged and so distraught at the experience, that he feels like he should be the one that should lay her to rest. He should be the one that should take her out and give her a proper burial in, what remains of the Fortress of Solitude, because again, all these different Earths Earths are still confined within this Netherverse. And so from here, I want to jump over to Barry Allen, to the death of Barry Allen, because this is one of the other huge things to happen in this story. Barry Allen's character had basically been popping in and out of time throughout this story, and I had actually skipped over that, and the reason why was because it would have seemed weird and out of place, and I was afraid it might have thrown you guys off. But since his capture by the Antimatter, Barry Allen has basically been manipulated time and time again by Psycho Pirate and effectively just tortured to the point where Barry Allen has to remember these terrible experiences. He has to remember the happy experiences that he can never go back to, and it's really just a way to mess with his mind. At the same time, we also have Darkseid from the New Gods and Apocalypse, which exist in this Netherverse. Now, Darkseid in this situation is actually really intriguing because he doesn't actually do anything. And that's one of the funny situations here, is because we would expect someone as capable as Darkseid to either ally himself with the Antimatter or ally himself with the superheroes. But in some form or fashion, he would fight. Instead, he says, nope, we're gonna stay hands off and we're gonna wait. And the reason why is he says, if the superheroes are successful, things will go back to the way they used to be, and I'll be doing the exact same thing I did before. If the superheroes are not successful, they would have put up one hell of a fight, which means that Antimatter would be weaker, which means I can defeat him and I can recreate reality the way that I want it to be. And so for him, it's really just a waiting game. It's just an intelligent game to play to see how things end up. And so again, you know, with Barry Allen picking up with his character, he had basically been kind of stirring in his powers because they had gradually been coming back while they had been suppressed during his time under the control of the Antimatter. And when he makes his escape, he's able to easily subdue a Psycho Pirate here, and he immediately takes off to the core of this antimatter cannon that the Antimatter has assembled, because the goal of the Antimatter is to use this cannon, fire it into oblivion, and recreate all things. And so Barry Allen comes to the realization, of course, as a scientist, that if this cannon is composed of antimatter, then it's going to take a sufficient amount of positive matter to basically destroy it. And so his idea is to basically reverse the polarity of this cannon by running in the direction counter to where this cyclone's going. And so he basically creates a wind tunnel effect that reverses the spin of this antimatter cannon, effectively dispersing the antimatter in its entirety and destroys the cannon. But in the process of doing this, he starts fluctuating throughout all space and time. And this is why those of you guys who go and read Crisis on Infinite Earths, you'll see moments where he just pops up and he sees Batman for a second and says, hey, you have to save us, and then vanishes. This is likely what's happening with regards to the Batman Superman movie when we saw the Flash appear out of nowhere. This is the kind of thing that was taking place, is he was basically fluctuating throughout all space and time, but ultimately his actions are successful in destroying the antimatter cannon. The problem is that he simply ceases to exist. Now, when this story happened, the initial belief was that Barry Allen died. That was the thought process. Barry Allen's gone, he's dead, and he's never coming back. As we found out with Final Crisis, he was basically just lost in the Speed Force. That was really all that was going on. And so because of this, it's really just kind of like this last man standing. It's this final battle, or at least it seems to be this final battle that's taking place between the superheroes that remain and you know, those people who are basically trying to take their place, or at least villains who are just doing villain stuff. Now, the kicker with this is that when it comes to the regular supervillains that we're used to, they had their own plan, in the sense that the only way to keep this cycle from repeating is to go back in time and to stop Krona from observing the universe in the first place. The problem with this is that they're supervillains. So when they do that, when they travel back into the past and they try to stop Krona, they ultimately start fighting among one another, which results in Krona observing the origin of all things anyway. In addition to this, with these various forces who are fighting amongst themselves, Jim Corrigan pops up and says, hey, you guys have to stop this. You know, the Antimatter is not dead. The Antimatter is alive, and we have to work to essentially destroy him. And from here, this is where things get a little weird. From here, we're suddenly met by the arrival of Superboy Prime. Now, this is really just Marv Wolfman throwing Superboy Prime into the story. There was a story arc in, I think it was DC Presents issue number 81, and that explained where it was that he came from, which you guys can actually find that in my video on Superboy Prime Explained. But the fact is that he's here. Now, Superboy Prime is wildly powerful. In terms of the remnants of these various Supermen who are left, Superboy Prime is the most powerful out of all of them. But the idea here is to basically find the Antimatter and to eliminate him before he can, you know, essentially try to wipe all things out, or at least wipe out what remains of these superheroes. And so because of the fact that Krona is able to witness the Antimatter, I guess witness the creation of all things, because of the fact that the Antimatter is able to travel back to the creation of all things, we learn that the hand that Krona witnessed was the Antimatter's hand rising up. But the view screens that the villains are watching in the past, as they're standing alongside Krona, it actually changes, so that when Spectre and the Antimatter are fighting one another, that they see the hand of the Spectre and the Antimatter. So it's basically just an idea of how this multiversal battle is influencing the origin of all creation. And so what ends up happening is that in this conflict between the Antimatter and Spectre, it results in the fracturing of reality as it seems to exist, and everything comes crashing down. And and then it immediately reforms in the form of New Earth. Now, the kicker about this is that all these heroes have no histories. As far as the universe is concerned, this is day one and they're all just here. And so there's no backstories. They have no origin stories. It's almost as if the character had just been written and nobody ever wrote a backstory for them. That's basically where we are right now. And so the stage is set. Marv Wolfman has made the slate. He set the stage for the origin stories that these characters will get after Crisis on Infinite Earths is over. But what we also learn here is that the Antimatter is not necessarily dead. The Antimatter's essence still exists. And so what we have is this situation where Superman from Earth 2 realizes that his wife Lois Lane is dead. Superman from Earth 1 knows that Supergirl is dead. The lives they had before are gone. And so they basically have to make do as best they can. Not only that, once the Antimatter reconstructs itself, or at least reconstructs its essence and begins reforming its physical body, the Superman from Earth 2 lashes out. Superman from Earth 2 has had enough of everything the Antimatter is doing. And so what he does, and this is actually one of the most impressive displays of power in this story, Superman Earth 2 just loses it and ultimately just punches the absolute shit out of the Antimatter to the point that it seems to disperse his energies in its entirety. Now, of course, we also have a lot of other superheroes who are fighting alongside him as well, but the goal here is that the Antimatter's essence has effectively been completely obliterated. The Antimatter has been completely destroyed. And so what this does is this allows the superheroes to begin trying to figure out what they're going to do next to try to get things sorted out. Now, with regards to those of you guys who read Infinite Crisis, this is where things began to pick up. This is where you guys got Earth 2 Superman, Superboy Prime, who ended up going on a rampage. This is where they came from. What happened was that with Earth 2 completely gone, Alexander Luthor reveals that Lois Lane is alive, that she had effectively been reborn with New Earth, but he had kept her hidden away from the danger so that she wouldn't be killed in the conflict, because she would have been brought back, exactly where all this was happening. And so when her presence is revealed, Alexander Luthor basically says, we're people without a home. We have nowhere to go. And so essentially he takes them all, or whisks them all away to a pocket dimension. Now, originally, this was supposed to be the end. This was going to be the end of the Earth 2 Superman. This was going to be the end of Superboy Prime. This was going to be the end of the Earth 2 Lois Lane. Their stories were going to be finished, and they were for 20 years until Jeff Johns brought them back in Infinite Crisis. But as the story wraps up, all it basically says is that we're getting a start over. We're basically getting a refresh, that these characters are going to start getting their own origin stories, that with Barry Allen having been killed, that Wally West now takes his place due to the fact that his age was jump-started when the New Earth was reformed. It's essentially, this idea that we have a continuation of a lot of the characters that we like, but the origin stories of where they came from are going to be told in publications coming after. But with that being said, what a story. God, I know I wasn't able to cover everything, guys, but this was 12 issues of double-page giant-sized comics, so it was way too much to cram into one single video, but I think we did pretty well. So if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah. Let me know in the comments section down below, how much do you guys like Crisis on Infinite Earths, because I love this story. It's super good. But yeah, so I will catch you all later. Peace.